structure of the evening is quite simple. We have statements to make, which we will keep as brief as we possibly can. And then we really want to hear from the artists who are present, both the people who have come from the distant land of America and from the near, not so distant land of Montreal. And I think really that's what we want to hear. Is like you're the soldiers on the ground with the Polaroid material. You had to make it work. We came along later and just picked the fruit, you know. A lot of it low lying, what's it called? Low hanging fruit. And there was a lot of it. We didn't have to climb too high on the branches to find remarkable material. So I'm just going to restrict my introduction to just a couple of words. Who was here last night at the opening? Well, that's what I thought.
Can everyone hear, or should Phil use the microphone?
Oh. You're supposed to use the microphone for the recording as well.
Oh, so it's also, I'll repeat myself now. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so sorry about that. So yeah, I don't want to repeat what I said yesterday, which we were held to 2 minutes each, and we tried to make it as much a kernel of our collective wisdom as possible. But I do, for those of you who weren't here, simply to say a couple of words. One, that the exhibition grew out of emotion. My museum in Lausanne housed the European part of the Polaroid collection. Basically, a third of the collection, some 4,000 works. I found it when I took the job in 1996. There had just been a Polaroid show at the museum, so I did nothing with it for close to a decade. And then in 2008, I received a horrible letter from an American judge saying, we're taking the collection back. It belongs to the defunct Polaroid Corporation. And I kind of panicked, and I thought I could hide. I thought he would forget the letter after he sent it, but he didn't. He kept sending reminders, and with the chilling phrase that they were going to sell it at auction. Sotheby's was going to sell it at auction. Anyway, Barbara and I put our heads together and sort of hid it. We kept it, you know, possession is 9/10 of the law. So we made it very difficult for them to get it. We said, well, Switzerland, you know, we have treaties, and it's not so simple, and you don't speak French. And so we did, the judge was sympathetic. He agreed that he would leave it together and hope that we'd find a single buyer. I tried to find the money for it. I couldn't find enough money for it. A long story is it was sold to a single buyer in Vienna. The Impossible Project people, you know about, they tried to reconstitute the Polaroid process. So that was all kind of good news. And meanwhile, the big American collection was bought by a single buyer. And that was fabulous news. But anyway, at this moment, I didn't know that. And I decided to organize an exhibition called Polaroid in Peril. And I wanted to get a public reaction. Well, the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People cried at the opening. They brought their Polaroids. They brought their pictures. They brought their cameras. It was almost like a kind of cult situation. And encouraged by this reaction, we arranged for the show to be shown in Arles in the festival, the big festival in Arles in the summer. Same thing, same reaction. And it was the reaction of the photographers and the general public. So at that time, I said, listen, we got to do something much bigger than this. Not just restricted to the collection, our collection, which was 4,000 pieces, but it was still a narrow selection. And I talked to Todd about it, and Todd is the director of the Foundation for the Exhibition of Photography, nonprofit. And he said, yeah, let's do it, and quickly got in touch with Barbara, who said, yes, absolutely, count me in. And Debbie came in very quickly with the Polaroid collection at MIT, and the project was born. There were a lot of rocky points. There were points where we thought maybe we wouldn't find the money for it. There were points where we were afraid that one or two of the new owners would not be too happy with this, but we proceeded with the big collections, and also contacting a lot of photographers we knew had taken Polaroid, who had kept a lot of material themselves. And that is, in essence, what this Polaroid project is. And I would just add to that our selection was like slow cooking. We kept looking and thinking, should we put that in? Well, we have something like that already. Do we have everything? Do we have all the tendencies? Do we have nudes? Do we have fashion? Do we have filmmakers who use the camera? Do we have purely experimental technique? We kept thinking and going back to the collection, because we made quite a few trips. I made quite a few trips with you to Cambridge. Looking and then talking also with Debbie and looking at the technical material and thinking of how we could tie things together. So it was so slow cooking. And meanwhile, people would contact us and say, oh, we hear you're doing a Polaroid show. I've got 4,000. You know, that happened a lot. That happened a lot. People often talk about hundreds or thousands of Polaroids they've taken over the years. So we'd like to think our selection is representative of many things, many tendencies, but it's not absolute, it's not a final word, and that's why we call it the project. It's meant to be a kind of proposition. Maybe we should have called it that, the Polaroid proposition. Say, okay, this is what we kind of, you know, this is like a mirror reflection of the bigger reality. People last night said to me, why wasn't so-and-so in the show? I said, oh, well, it could be. You know, we thought about that, but we had to stop somewhere. So everyone feels passionately about it. So they kind of want the people they know who took Polaroids. If you're a fashion person, you want the fashion photographers because they all took Polaroids, right? If you're a filmmaker, you want the filmmakers who took Polaroids because a lot of them took Polaroids. So we feel that it's representative without being in any way kind of definitive. And in 10 years, we expect to see another Polaroid show, maybe called Polaroid Project 2. And we'll be very happy, won't we? We'll be very happy to have that. So with that, a brief description, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara, whom I'm embarrassed yesterday by calling her a national treasure. I was wrong, international treasure, because she was at Polaroid for 40 years, and she not only knew land and she knew all the key players, but she worked individually with many of the photographers building up the collection. Over to you.
Okie dokie. If you don't mind, I'll go stand there.
Oh, sure. And this way we can see your shoes.
Pardon me?
We can see your shoes this way then.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, Bill encouraged me to be very brief, and I had like 7 or 8 minutes, and so he said, write it. And I said, okay, so you're going to hear the tip of the iceberg, and some of this might be a little familiar to some of you who were here the other day, but I hope that you will be very happy to ask questions when we have that opportunity, because there's so much that I'm not going to tell you, and I can assure you some of it is really great stuff. So, true. So I'd love to continue to try my presentation in French, but I have friends in France who said, no, Mrs. Hitchcock, because my French is so bad, so I'll spare you. Because many people continue to ask me about the Polaroid collection. I thought I'd provide a very brief description of its origins and how it evolved over time. To add spice to historic points, I'll share some special memories of visits, perhaps encounters with artists. But first, responding to his daughter Jennifer's question, why can't I see the photograph now, Daddy? Edwin Land, as you know, the inventor of Polaroid instant film and the founder of the corporation, spent 1 hour thinking about how to make instant film happen, a whole system. It then took him 3 years in the lab to realize a marketable instant system that went on sale at a Boston department store in 1948. Maybe some of you will remember Jordan Marsh. This was also the year when when Dr. Land met Ansel Adams, who was this wonderful California landscape photographer. He soon hired him as a consultant to test Polaroid products and to help him build a photography collection. With a fistful of dollars from Polaroid, Adams bought exquisite black and white photographs made by the luminaries of the time, like Dorothea Lange and Margaret Bourke-White and Imogen Cunningham and Edward Weston and Minor White, to name a few. This work was destined to be exhibited with Polaroid photographs made with instant film to illustrate the high quality of Polaroid prints, and the intention really was to have them side by side on a gallery wall. Adams also provided cameras and film to the renowned artists so they too could enjoy the magic of instant photography. Seeking to introduce Polaroid photography to young aspiring artists, the company looked for local talent. One young Boston photographer named Nick Dean applied for a job in Land's laboratory. He later described this experience, and I'm going to quote here. "My job interview was unusual. Instead of the usual round of resumes and application forms, my audition was simply to spend a week photographing. When I returned with the prints, Dr. Land's assistant spread them out on a table, handed me a yellow pad, and asked me to make a list of everything I knew how to do, whether it was related to photography or not. Together, she and Land then looked at the prints and to my list and announced that I was hired. Then from down the hall came Ansel Adams, an awesome figure to a young photographer. He was waving his arms and said, 'This is quite a place,' and disappeared." Well, indeed, it was quite a place. In 1968, Polaroid initiated a formal collecting program designed for the ongoing acquisition of photographs made with Polaroid films. Artists received cameras and film in Polaroid selected artwork for its fledgling collection. A committee of Polaroid employees, or engineers and scientists, marketing managers, technicians, biannually reviewed portfolios placed on the floor along the walls. Committee members picked up each photograph in those portfolios and examined them. Then they voted on them. Those with the highest scores were obtained for the Polaroid collection. Rather unorthodox, I'd say. But then why would one expect conventional at a place like Polaroid, where innovation and invention and doing the impossible were the norm? In the 1980s, curatorial professionals took over the decision-making process of what is now known as the Artist Support Program. I was lucky enough to have participated in each of these evolving curatorial strategies and ultimately became the Polaroid Collection's sole curator. One of the true joys that resulted was the opportunity for me to meet and to get to know talented creative artists. For instance, I would fly to New York City from Boston with a case of SX70 film tucked under my arm to deliver to André Cortege at his home in Washington Square. Here was this legendary figure spending hours telling me his life stories over a glass of Lillet Blanc. It became clear that the SX70 photographs that he took of objects in the window were actually his love letters to his deceased wife, Elizabeth. And you'll see a selection of this work upstairs here in the McCord. In the early 1980s, we extended the Artist Support Program grant-making to include the 20 by 24 photography program. This meant my budget to purchase Polaroid film and equipment destined for artists was increased dramatically because I invited select artists to use our 20 by 24 camera systems in one of our studios. I occasionally visited our studio doing the shoots. Once I witnessed Bill Wegman positioning his Weimaraner, Fay Ray, on an elevated, very, very, very narrow board in front of the camera. The dog kept her paws together, even as she started to fall. Trusting that Bill would catch her, and he always did. These were his celebrity actors, and they would absolutely do anything for him once the lens of the camera was pointed at them. Collecting photographs moments after they were made was novel and fun, but most acquisitions occurred actually in portfolio reviews that were periodically held either in my office or artist spaces or at museums. Going through artist images from helping Lucas Amaris retrieve a stash of photographs which he stored under his bed, to look at an artist portfolio on my lap just when an enormous cockroach emerged from the print could really be quite exciting. I hate bugs. Nonetheless, the Polaroid collection grew dramatically during the 70s and 80s. The black and white landscape genre had become less influential. Photographic experimentation in both the aesthetic and technical arenas had arrived, ushering in creative, innovative imagery. Artist-generated hand-painted prints, antique processes, image transfer, and color photographs to illustrate their ideas and experiences. The Polaroid photograph became an unfinished canvas, begging for the artist's touch. As you view the Polaroid images displayed here, I hope that, like me, you will be delighted by the elegant black and white prints, as well as fascinated by the artist's imagination and technical explorations of film used to visualize concepts and express personal viewpoints, as well as document reality. I also hope that you will enjoy looking at and learning from these photographs here at the McCord Museum that represent a major movement in contemporary photography. Merci.
So last night, I made a series of bold assertions about democracy and greatness and human creativity. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit tonight and talk a little bit about invention in more detail. And I will begin this way with a quote from Edwin Land. In 1975, he did an interview for the Forbes business magazine. And he made this statement. He said, "Over the years, I have learned that every significant invention has several characteristics. By definition, it must be startling, unexpected, and must come into the world that is not prepared for it. For if the world were prepared for it, it would not be much of an invention." Think about that statement. If the world were prepared for it, it would not be much of an invention. We're going to have an opportunity to hear from artists who used this equipment and film as part of their media and form of expression. So we'll get a chance to see their perspective on invention and creativity. But I wanted to explore that topic a little bit through the lens of a historian of technology, somebody who spends time thinking about science, technology, and that creativity from a different perspective. So Land's observation is compelling, but here's the big question. Is significance simply a function of surprise? Land said that one shouldn't, quote, undertake a project unless it's manifestly important and nearly impossible, and that a researcher needed courage, his word was guts, a willingness to fail, and the ability to concentrate intensely for hour after hour. And the list of qualities enumerated by Land make clear that he was obsessed with a quest to understand both invention and greatness. Now, there's no shortage of quotations or writings by and about Land on this subject, But I think we should probe even deeper still. The realization of absolute instant photography was a development process, as Barbara has just suggested, that required 3 decades of sustained effort. 3 years just to get the first draft, if you will, the first iteration, a sepia print that was good enough to sell, and a camera that weighed 5 pounds. Think about that, you know, lugging that around. There are computers and laptops that are lighter than that. It was an immense scientific achievement. The chemists call it one of the most difficult chemical engineering challenges of all time. So sometimes you hear all this language and you may think the 3 of us are in the thrall of the PR and marketing department of Polaroid. But, and that may or may not be true, I don't know. I may have gone native already. But really, in terms of science and chemistry, this is a really phenomenally difficult challenge, and its achievement represents a high point in that world. So Bill and Barb have already shared, you know, that at the heart of the Polaroid project is this assertion that you will never fully understand or appreciate the invention if you don't explore the dynamic relationship between the artisan and the inventor. Now, the gallery walls are filled with the beautiful photographs that these two and the contributors who offered up their works helped to curate. But those pictures are in dialogue with the artifacts in the cases. Now, I'm fully aware that the cameras on display, many of them are really evocative. Visitors may not just recognize them, but some of them have used them. How many of you here have used a Polaroid camera at some point in your life? Yes, so, you know, we have our own small display of, we've had our own small display of Polaroid cameras up for a decade, and I never get tired of listening, I sneak in and I just listen to the conversations, and people will, are explaining to their children or grandchildren, well, you take the picture and it came out instantly, but it's not like your phone. You had the picture. You know, you didn't have to go to a printer. I want to draw your attention, though, away from those commercial products for a minute and suggest there's, at the end of the case, there's a whole bunch of prototypes, cutaways, experimental models, and sketches. And that's another kind of artistry if you're willing to look and contemplate it. So who made all that stuff? Who invented the new chemical compounds and orchestrated the elaborate choreography of reactions? Who obsessed endlessly about form and function? Who were the artists behind the shutter button? Those are really good questions, and mostly their names, except for Land's, are unknown and will probably forever be unknown unless you delve deeply. Sometimes those names appear on a patent form or as a co-inventor with Land. But here's the question: why should anyone care? Why does it matter that it took thousands of tries to get a picture good enough for Polaroid to sell it? Isn't that just the work of R&D? That's just science, not art. That's just technology and culture, right? It turns out Land believed we all have the potential to investigate, to analyze, to build, to record, to create. He wanted scientists that worked at the lab bench in the morning and on the shop floor in the afternoon and vice versa. Now, this was somewhat of a utopian fantasy. I realize it, but Land's thought was, quote, industry is best at the intersection of science and art. And much of his personal laboratory was staffed in the earliest years by young women who had majored in art history at Smith College. His wife went to Smith, so he was very loyal to the college. He believed that each of us had the potential to be great. But what he loved about those art history majors is that they were not hindered by the prejudices and preconceptions of chemistry or chemical engineering. Now, later on, he did hire a great many chemists and mechanical engineers and physics majors. But in fact, the first photograph was made by Eudoxia Mueller. There's a name we do know. She was following Land's directions. She was an artist and later a champion of the arts. And she had studied with, or had been a student of Clarence Kennedy at Smith. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment. Clarence Kennedy was the person who brought Land to photography. Clarence Kennedy actually coined the name Polaroid. And it was the 1930s, and he told Land, I wish there was a way to show my students sculptures in 3D. You know, I can't take them to Europe. There was no cheap flight, you know, to Europe for summertime exploration. A few affluent students had been and traveled to see some of these, but he said, can I bring them 3D in the classroom? And that led, at the end of the row in the gallery, there's a tiny little sheet of cardboard in the shape of a car, and if you held it up, if you went to the 1939's World's Fair and went to the Chrysler Pavilion, you had held this up because you got to see a Plymouth car in 3D. It was this new film technology, vectograph, and he was fiddling with that when World War II started, and then the military wanted in on this technology. So right next to that little car is a book that says U.S. Navy training volume for vectographs. If you go deeper in the gallery, you can see a vectograph of Michelangelo's David that Clarence Kennedy made here. Put the glasses on and you can see this 3D images. Well, to do all that, this is the beginning of Polaroid. That 1 hour that Barb says he took him to do it, you think, oh my God, how did the man do this in just an hour? Well, that's because he had about 3 years of fiddling with vectographs. And the first way you made that print was you combined two images. Anyone see a stereoscope? You know, those stereograph cards. And you know the camera takes two images about the same distance of your eye. You put them in, and there you get a kind of 3D depth perception of a particular image. So they kind of started with that idea, two images, and they had two rollers, and you would smear these positive images between these rollers onto the film base. And so that's how they made these initial vectographs. And he got thinking, geez, I wonder if you could take a positive and a negative and squish them through rollers and transfer the image that way. And so he was already thinking about these problems. And it's in that moment, so that when Jennifer, supposedly asked her famous question, every other 4-year-old's father would have said, no, I don't know, you can't, because you can't. But Land was a unique person. Louis Pasteur says chance favors a prepared mind. This was a case where, Jennifer's question triggered a kind of catalytic line of thought for him that resulted in this innovation. So that launched what became for the company a new experimental program. So X for experimental, it was called SX-70, S for secret, X for experimental, and it was program number 70. If you look at really old cameras in our collection, you see them marked SX-70 on them. Now, I could go on, but you should read Vic McElhaney's fine biography of Land, insisting on the impossible. If you want the full details about Land's biography or company, it's really one of the best. But Barb made the point that Land turned right away to one of the preeminent photographers of the 20th century and asked for his opinion. That's an extraordinary moment. Everybody else would go to Harvard Business School up the street and ask their MBAs. And Land says, I have no use for these people. They are, they'll tell me about yesterday's product and something that, nobody else wants. And he believed he wanted artists to test the products. These were like the test pilots of, that the military had to fly rockets or spaceships. I mean, these were people that used this equipment every day. They were magnificently experienced in their own emotions and how to calibrate them and their ideas and turn them into color and forms and shapes. They were the perfect people to test equipment with and give feedback with. And so he turned to them, and then, whatever their opinions were, that became the company's corporate strategy. I don't think there is another R&D company in the world that turned to an artist community for their principal corporate strategy. And by the way, that when they stopped doing it in the 70s, they distracted you, John, with your big 20 by 24 studio and all these artists with these programs. But when they stopped really listening to artists, it's not entirely coincidental that this is the point at which the company's fortunes and strategies changed. So I make this point. Kodak, when it introduced its Instamatics, had a saying. It was, you push the button and we do the rest. And Polaroid reframed that and said, you push the button and the camera does the rest. And over the next quarter century, from the mid-70s, Polaroid became one of those iconic artifacts of our instant era. And that's the last point I really want to leave you with, is that somewhere from the time of this invention in the early 40s to the present day, we live in this time of instant. We don't just want fast. I mean, the late 19th century was the culture of time and speed, space and speed, rapid movement in Europe and the United States. And we introduced airplanes and streamlined trains and automobiles and movies and radio, telephones, quick. But what happened from the time of the invention of instant film to the time of Polaroid's demise is an astonishing, exponential increase in the pace of modern society. I don't think it's an accident that the heyday in the 60s and 70s, this is a highly experimental time. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we were doing it all, and Polaroid was part of that. So like the, in a good way. In a good way. It's the one icon you can point to with your kids and not worry too much. It's you're offering the clean icon, Suzanne and Helene, of a highly experimental era, an unconventional era, and so we go from Edgerton stopping time to these unbelievable images and technologies of the internet and Instagram, which, by the way, uses Polaroid and its frame as one of its symbols. But this is, if you were to ask people, what are the iconic artifacts of our era? That Polaroid camera and photograph are truly one of a set of objects that define our times. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it has endured even in the company's demise. And so you might say, well, geez, it kind of went bankrupt. What happened? Is it pessimistic? And what's going on here? And I want you to consider all of the companies that have arisen in the last quarter century, extraordinary new companies. And climate change is the great challenge of our time. 50 years ago, humans walked on the moon thanks to the achievements of hundreds of thousands. Land and Polaroid managed to solve one of the most difficult chemistry problems of the 20th century. I fervently hope that there is an army of Edwin Lands, that there are 21st century Polaroids applying their creative energies to this solution of climate change. And I know that as I go through the exhibition and I look at those photographs on the wall, whether they're big or small, whether they're bold or bright, whether they're soft or subtle, I'm looking at you, Ellen and John. I feel like I got you both here. They all, whether they're shocking or silly, they all inspire me and remind me what is best about humanity and the human spirit. So to you, John and Ellen, to Sam, to all of the artists here tonight, thank you for representing the artistic community. You make me hopeful.
Land was introduced to Ansel by Clarence Kennedy. And Kennedy, of course, knew his work well and knew that he was a really advocate of photography. And he showed the work to Land. Land was fascinated by it, loved it. In fact, bought Ansel's first portfolio. I think it was like 10 pictures for $100. $100. And they established this friendship, and it evolved into this consultation role for the rest of Ansel's life. He was still consulting for Polaroid, you know, in the hospital when he passed away. And they became true friends. They used to photograph together. They'd go to Santa Fe, and they would be running around the countryside taking pictures. And I can relay one little item, is that when they were photographing a house in Santa Fe, and the woman of the house came out, and Ansel said, "I hope you don't mind taking pictures of your house." She said, no, you and your son go right ahead and take pictures." But they enjoyed each other's company. They played jokes on each other. They both definitely liked a good cocktail at the end of the day. So this was a relationship that was based upon a friendship. It was based upon a common love of photography, and the fact that they both believed that photography was an art form, and that there's this kernel of creativity and artistic bent in every single one of us. And if you're given the opportunity, you'd be able to express it through photography. And I think that was the undercurrent of this incredible relationship.
Debbie, can you, going back to the technical and creative aspect, the thing that seduced me when you first showed me the objects were the beautiful little origami-like cardboard paper attempts to get the SX70 design right. And there were hundreds of them, or dozens of them, I can't remember how many. But you've talked about how you always had to go into a meeting with something to show. And that might be interesting to people.
Yes, so everything in the mid-20th century, no, I know, I'm worried about feedback, so forgive me. In the mid-20th century, when you did R&D, you didn't have 3D printers, you didn't have CAD, you had a shop full of model makers who could work in especially wood, but they also used whatever evolving materials were available, so styrofoam, plastic, paper. And Land really didn't think you understood your idea unless you could express it physically. Like, you had to be able to build a model or to demonstrate it. So there are literally blocks of wood. I think there's a block of wood. It's a sort of lovely carved form, and that was just to get an idea of the form and the shape and the size. One side note, Polaroid cameras cannot be smaller than the size of the picture you want to create. So if your picture is 20 by 24, the camera is going to be at least 20 by 20 inches wide and 24 inches tall. I mean, it's just has to be that way. You can't, there's no spy cameras here in Polaroid. I guess you have to have some reason to buy a Kodak roll of film. But they then experimented with every aspect, the folding mechanisms, the shape of the rollers, the optical configurations, and those forms follow physics in a sense, but they're incredibly beautiful. And I don't know whether to say form follows function or function follows form, but certainly in the labs and shops of Polaroid, it was filled with small works of art. These are really beautiful pieces. And as the company was closing up, it's unbelievable. Like a lot of this stuff, some people took stuff home. They took their notebooks home. They took bucket loads of parts. But it was overwhelming, all of these models. And so there would be just these bins outside of people's doors of cast-off models. And a local artist, Tom Norton, actually went through with buckets and collected parts and cameras, of which he gave us about 20, 2 of which are actually on display here, things that he had salvaged from this, because in his own artistic eye, he just thought they were exquisitely beautiful works.
I'm John Reuter. I'm represented upstairs by some very early work of mine, my SX70 work, which I did prior to working for Polaroid. I was actually supported as an artist while I was in graduate school. So that stuff is from the 70s. I later went on to work for Polaroid out of graduate school in 1978, being offered the 20x24 job as well as a different studio at Polaroid, a research studio. And after 2 or 3 months of going back and forth, I actually did not take the 20x24 job at first. I did the research studio for quite a while. And in 1980, the job became available again, so I went over to that finally. So throughout that period, I was a full-time employee at Polaroid. I eventually, they closed the studio and we moved it to the museum school in Boston. And then we were under the program that Elko Wolf and Barbara were running for Polaroid, and so I worked for Barbara for a number of years. We moved the studio to New York in 1986, partly to generate a lot more commercial income from it. Prior to that, I started working with artists such as Ellen Carey is to my right here, and Evergon here, for decades. So I've had a really unique position, with Polaroid materials, not only using them on my own, because I wanted to, and then became a sponsored artist, and then finally working for the company in many capacities, working with the research scientists, and later on marketing people and people in manufacturing. So I've had a really unique experience of the company itself and the people that were there, but also with a number of artists. And so the most special thing about the 20x24, despite all of the challenges, and I must tell you there are many, in keeping a project like that going for as long as we have, but it's always been the individual artists that I've worked with that made it so special, because as an artist, or even if you were a teacher, you would confront people and work with them on a certain way. You might have lunch with peers or something like that, but there's nothing like working directly alongside another artist, particularly established artists. I'm talking like Chuck Close and Robert Rauschenberg, Mary Ellen Mark, people like that, heroes of yours that you're now actually responsible for helping them, create what they want with this sort of very unyieldy camera. So that part has been the biggest privilege of it all. And, we've kept it going. It's still going today. I spun out a company in 2009 or 2010. And we make the film available today. Believe it or not, we've just opened a new studio in Berlin. So there's an uptick in activity. So there may be some surprises still in store. We don't know. But it's the last living vestige of original Polaroid film that is actually accessible today. So it's still quite beautiful to use and everything. And I also have another perspective on it, and then I'm also doing a historic documentary film about the history of the 20x24. So I've interviewed as many as 25 different people at Polaroid who worked in those shops and were part of the engineering teams, as well as the PR people, the marketing people. I've interviewed Barbara, I've interviewed Elko Wolf, and many of the artists that I've done. So it's a work in progress, and it also just gives me a very interesting perspective on something that I've lived through, but now I can actually go back and talk to the same people that I worked with, some as many as 30 years ago. So that's also a pretty special place to be in.
John, could you just explain, let's say Wegman would come to the studio,
Mm-hmm.
or anyone comes to the studio, what does that mean? They come in the morning, you're there?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty workmanlike environment, Well, we've had several studios over the years, but some as many as 1,200 to 1,400 square feet. We had a pretty great space in New York on Broadway at Pritt Street for a number of years.
And they would have to bring their own stuff.
Well, yeah, dogs and eventually props with someone like Bill. You know, Bill initially started as a supported artist. This is kind of the way it worked, particularly with the successful people that drove the studio commercially. We're all supported artists in the beginning. So Wegman was certainly a person like that. David Leventhal, you know.
Artists mean what exactly?
Well, part of their artist support programs. So through various, either curators suggesting to Barbara, or people going directly to Barbara, or Barbara reaching out to people that maybe she'd just seen or admired their work.
So they were proposed, yeah.
Right, so it was a bartering program. We had various relationships of how that went, but usually it was a day. You would get 32 sheets of film, and you had to get Polaroid 4 images, which is actually quite a bit. So eventually artists like Bill would opt out because the work became too, it was less expensive for him to rent to do that. So, and then he would occasionally be supported just because he liked being in the Polaroid collection. That's a very important distinction too, is the kind of the honor that I think artists felt to be in the Polaroid collection. It was a big deal to fine art photographers, I think, you know, to either be supported or put on the back of Aperture, or they, you know, Polaroid was very actively placing magazine articles and stuff, and really launched a lot of careers. You know, that I can't think of any parallel relationship with a corporation where it would generate that sort of thing happening, you know, through 20 by 24, or even, you know, in some of the other formats. You know, there was this very special and unique relationship that I don't think will ever be equaled by anyone. You don't see it like someone like a Google or an Apple, or who all have the resources times 10 to do what Polaroid did, but they don't have the, you know, the structure of that relationship really that gets established. So that's one of the most unique things about it, to me, anyway.
Thank you. Helen, can you tell us something about your relationship?
Well, I have to comment on some of the things that were talked about that Albert Einstein said, art and science are branches of the same tree. So we talked a little bit about that. And one of the things of note is in the beginning, at the dawn of photography, we have William Henry Fox Talbot, who couldn't draw, and moi aussi, I cannot either. And most photographers I've discovered over the years really can't paint, can't draw, can't sculpt. So it was an existential revelation when I discovered the darkroom. And in high school, I got a Polaroid camera from my parents and moved quickly through their materials. The SX70 in 1972, beautiful, and the Polaroid positive negative film, and went to Kansas City Art Institute. I was born in New York, and went to Buffalo, which was the home of the avant-garde. So when I give my lectures, I talk about Back to the Future. The avant-garde is an address. We have email addresses, and Polaroid, of course, was one of those addresses. In the late 70s, I moved to New York, and I think it was 83, I believe. I went to work with the Polaroid 2024, and I was sponsored by Sam Yanes, and the exchange was to did experimental work. Prior work to that, I was painting on, my work had always been experimental, but I was painting over the images. And it was the real beauty of this one particular shoot. I remember in 1983, I was doing these self-portraits and I was part of that neo-expressionist group in Soho, and David Sally and Julian Schnabel and Cindy, the figure, and there was abstract expression, neo-abstract expressionists, and my background is I'm an American artist, and Polaroid is American, and the part of the avant-garde from Paris to New York, the abstract expressionists, minimal conceptual art, etc. But the scale and the beauty of the palette made me rethink of painting on this beautiful Polaroid material. So in 1984, I went back into the studio and did these multiple exposures, and those kind of neo-geo, psychedelic, predate digital imaging, and then moved through that, leaving the figure behind, the self-portrait, to stacking the images, going towards abstraction, and then moving to the absence of what we call in photography the picture sign, the landscape, the portrait, the still life, and so forth. And in my work, I just photograph light, and I'm using the camera specifically what Donald Judd, when the aluminum was discovered and manufactured and he used plexi boxes, he was very interested in the specificity of the materials, which I am as well. So it's a one-step peel-away process. I'm keep all the negatives. I think it's fair to say that I'm the only artist that keeps the negatives and it exhibits the negatives, which has a reference again to William Henry Fox Talbot and of course color with Anna Atkins, our beloved Anna Atkins, both of whom were friends with Sir John Herschel, the chemist, who invented the cyanotype process and showed it to Anna Atkins and came up with the fixed solution, so the fixing the art of the shadow. Again, the shadow image is embedded in Polaroid. It has the it's a contact print, and it's very detailed. It doesn't have any grain, so it's like a daguerreotype. And the negative image is, again, echoes Talbot, and the color, of course, was also developed with Dr. Edward Land with Marie Cassendas, the late, great Marie Cassendas worked with Edward Land developing color. So in my work in 1996, I was going more and more towards minimalism and abstraction, and I often start my projects with a question: what is an abstract photograph? So after the program, we had the crash in New York in October, Black Monday, 1987. I went back into the dark room and asked myself this question: what is an abstract photograph? Which is a conundrum, a paradox. And I had studied at the great Albright Knox Art Gallery, which was actually the first museum to show photography with Alfred Stieglitz's gallery. And a lot of museums, which is a whole different topic, but thank you, McCord Museum, exhibit photography, because when I was an art student, it was, oh, is photography art? The question, of course, is mute at this point, but that was pretty much very active in a lot of people's minds. But I introduced this shape called the parabola. So I'm interested in the golden mean, all these different visual codes. And the Polaroid, again, a phrase comes to mind, Dr. Edwin's phrase, see what develops. So I'm an experimental artist. This Polaroid is very unique in that you have an object and an image. And I'm very interested in the integrity and authenticity and the beauty of the object with the image. So unlike our iPhones we were talking about, that's really just all image and no object to speak of until you see it later, of course. But in Polaroid materials, the dyes, it's just an incredibly beautiful process. I love experimenting. Of course, I take a lot of risks, and there's failures, and you were asking, how do you come to the studio? And I've kept notebooks and all kinds of, data on all that. But this shape that was introduced is called the parabola, and it's part of the cone family, and it's introduced is the first, this object, 1996. So my practice is called Photography Degree Zero, which references Roland Barthes's book, Writing Degree Zero. So there's no beginning, middle, end. There's no narrative arc. And there's nothing, what is this picture? How is this picture made? And what is this a picture of? And they're really all about light and process and the chemistry. And every time there's been a change in Polaroid in 2005, the pods were normally sealed in one envelope, the chemistry, and then that was sectioned off. So it was 2 pods. And anyway, it's long. I'm making new colors. Colors, of course, is an artist's universe, as we've just witnessed with the Monet haystacks. And the Polaroid, like music, photography is a universal language, and it's pre-language with our cave paintings and so forth. So, and I love size and scale. I mean, that's a really important component. So Robert Smithson, the great did the spiral jetty, could say, size could be a crack in the wall or the Grand Canyon, and if you've been to the Grand Canyon, you can sort of. So it's an incredible. I mean, all of photography is incredible for all different kinds of reasons, but it's just a really great, and I didn't give it up. So when we've gone through different machinations and economic downturns and up and down. And so somebody said to me, why do you keep doing it? And I said, well, why should I give it up? I don't want to give it up. You know, why should I? I get better and better every time I go to work. And I have a parallel practice in the darkroom called Struck by Light. And I'm crossing over. I just did a shoot last week, and we're really taking the negative. I'm very interested in the negative image, and there's a great book called The History of the Shadow in Art, but I'm actually crushing the negative in the darkroom and photographing that, using that to make, so they're Polaroid photographs, actually. So I don't know, it's great. And Edwin Land's great, and I'm an American artist, and I inherited all of that post-World War II, and color, Polaroid, female artists. It's great. It's all great. It's all great.
Sam Walker. Sam.
So I think I'm a little bit of an outlier here because I came to Polaroid kind of late in the game. Polaroid had gone defunct around the time that I really began using their materials. Polaroid kind of loomed large for me growing up because the company was based in the town over from where I lived, and I remember like riding my bike around the Polaroid corporate campus, which was this kind of amazing like 100-acre series of offices and factories with, I don't know, Barbara, if you remember, but all those pipes that would run over the hills, and I don't know what was in those, but I mean, I'm sure it was. Chemistry. I'm sure, yeah. And I've been thinking about what to say here tonight, and it keeps coming back to, and it's not unique to Polaroid necessarily, but or photography in general, but the how messy it was. Like some of the
Visceral.
yeah, the peel apart films. I remember going out for the first time with Type 55, and you had to have this little bucket full of sodium sulfite in solution, and the bucket was great because you could, once you peeled it apart and you had the negative, you could slide them into these slots, and it was seemingly very, straightforward. But when you're in the field and you're sort of running around or climbing up buildings, the bucket leaks, and your backpack becomes filled with like sodium sulfite solution, and
Dries to a nice powder.
yeah, I'd have these nice, I had a black backpack, and I'd have these nice kind of like white stains all over it, or like my car would be, have those stains, and it was just kind of, and then with the positives, you had these little tubes of varnish that you would have to coat the print with that just smelled like the most noxious, like awful smell. I just remember thinking, God, I really shouldn't be breathing this or something.
We used to coat 20 by 24s with that, with a 4-inch foam paintbrush, the whole thing.
Oh,
It was
God.
like painting with gasoline. It was,
And I actually mixed pods, a black and white pod with a color pod, big no-no, and I had to sign a waiver saying, if I get sick, nothing, won't talk to Polaroid. So it's true. It's a very visceral,
Yeah, you feel
different experience.
like you're, maybe working with oils or something. It's a little more, I mean, you get a lot of smells and things in the darkroom, but in this case, you're in the field or in the studio, and you're totally immersed in that.
We have, Sam, this very big piece, pretty big piece, Polaroid sign. And it really seems like a comment on the demise of Polaroid. Can you talk about that specific piece?
Yeah, so that piece, when you would go into the Polaroid campus, there were a couple of big but not huge signs, that said Polaroid and had the logo, the familiar, diamond shape. And when Polaroid went bankrupt and the property was sold, they blacked these signs out, in kind of rough fashion with spray paint. And I remember photographing it once as one image and thinking that it really didn't do it justice because, you know, you had to really get into the texture of the paint and, you know, each letter. So I went back with, I think, a ladder and a folding table because it was high enough that it was too high for my tripod. And so I had to set the tripod on a folding table and somehow move across this sign and make 5 images that lined up reasonably well. And I remember at the time just feeling like it was a miracle that I actually accomplished this.
Yeah, the book is a great read, by the way. Even, you know, they did a great job. I read it in one of my snowstorms.
Really seems like a kind of tombstone image. And that, of course, is
I also wrote an essay, by the way. Multi-talented here. I try.
So that was a project where I was photographing all of these factories and offices being torn down with this positive negative film, along with some other formats.
What year was that?
That was in 2011.
What are you doing more recently with Polaroid?
I have not been using Polaroid as of late, but I would love to. But it's just I don't know. I was really fond of the Type 55, and there is a group that I believe has been manufacturing some version of it, but I'm a little wary of getting into that. I remember shooting the 55 that I had bought, and you know, at that point, each shot cost at least $10 or something, or $20, and just being kind of sad, every time I took one because it was one less in the world. But I think you really
love and loss.
You
Those
had
are
to
the
make
universal themes, love and loss.
You had to make them count.
You had to make them count. That's true.
So,
are there any questions on my work or John or?
I was very impressed when I saw you working in Berlin, the actual size of the camera. Can you tell people more about the structure of it? Because I was kind of blown away by what a monster it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a large format camera. It has to, the film area has to deliver 20 by 24 inches. And so what's unique about the camera as well is it also contains all the film in it. So it's a roll film camera, essentially. So there's a large 22-inch negative at the top, and there's a roll of positive at the bottom, and then there's a tray in between that will hold each individual chemical pod, we call them. It's the reagent pack that actually initiates the development of the print. And so the camera is pretty consistent. The Polaroid built 5. The same metal and woodworking shops that used to make their models also made these cameras. So they're very skilled craftsmen who put them together. And they've actually aged really well. They're 40 years old now. So an average camera weighs 265 pounds. It is variable in height on a studio stand that will take it anywhere from 4 feet up to about 7 feet up in the air, and the bellows will extend anywhere from 17 inches to 60 inches. So it's just when it's fully extended, quite a big force. And even in, say, portrait mode, it's like 40 inches out. And so for the subjects and things, it's quite an intimidating object to be there. And it's a very unique way of working because the physical camera is so large, even more so than an 8x10, that the photographer has to be alongside of it, and there's a crew that's running it. It's almost like running a Panavision camera or something. To have 2 or 3 people running it for the photographer is usually the way to go with it. But that relationship's different because I'm photographing Ellen, and the lens is over here, and I'm over here, and I'm talking to her, and so then you have to get this person to relate to something that's not where you are, which is kind of a unique portraitist's problem,
How long did it take you to get used to?
To really feel that I could handle almost anything, about 3 years.
How many years?
3 years. Yeah, and that was working every day on it. When I first started doing it, we immediately moved to New York for a fall sort of marketing sort of thing, and I had done maybe 20, 30 exposures with it prior to that. So I'm down here now to demonstrate this for, you know, New York commercial photographers. And I'm on the phone with Cambridge to this guy, Alan McLean, that used to be in research, you know, like, I'm turning this knob here, what does this do? Because there's all kinds of, besides being a camera, it's also a printmaking machine. So there's a lot of parameters and physical settings that have to be important for the physical printing of a Polaroid picture. You know, the roller distances and the spring pressure and the motor speed and all those kind of things that I had no idea what I was doing when I started. But
and Ellen, how long did it take you to master?
I think I made my first pull. Well, I don't know. I was working on the 2024 since '83. So where are we now? I don't know. Long time. I think every shoot is experimental, and you know we're pulling it out from the camera, so we have a big table, and you know you have to be in shape. I think for sure. I think for photography, you know.
well, your work really evolved over a decade.
Decades,
before
yeah.
you even moved into the longer pieces. You
Yeah.
did a lot of single frames.
It's 60 seconds. It's a peel apart. One step, peel apart. 60 seconds. We go. You know, in one day, I think I can do quite a bit. You know, I do 2 or 3 days back to back. And, you know, I have to do pre-production. I have to get prepped for the pulls, which I came up with my own system. I took museum studies at the Albright Knox. I came up with my own system of packing. And there's a lot of work that goes into being an artist and photographer. Well, I keep the negatives with the positives. So the pulls, I think we did 12, 15.
12 or 15, then they're
12 or 15.
double-size pieces, too.
Yeah.
So.
Pulls and rollbacks, and they're experimental, and then we move on, and they have to dry overnight, and then I have to get there early and pack them all up, and I have a system. They have to be in glassine envelopes, and we use the white receiving paper and the tissue, so they don't get damp. They're all in mint condition, museum A+ condition, and then we go into a day, and then they have to dry, and I have to pack, so... It's
a much slower
arduous.
pace than it used to be.
It's
in
arduous.
the 80s and 90s with Wegman and David Leventhal, it was not uncommon to shoot 100 pieces of film in a day with that camera, which is just absurd.
Why is it slowed down?
The money. It was much less expensive then.
And they're cutting off at the traditional,
Yeah.
you know, mine goes out, I can do pulls. There's something called the gap, which I can make them 12 or 13 feet high by 22 inches. And then when I had my show at Matrix at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is the first public art museum in America, they have a contemporary art program where they highlight artists, because in the 70s we didn't have galleries to show in. So they, at this program, they're showing artists who in a traditional museum setting. So that we did the 40-80 camera in August. I think it was 125 degrees that day. And I had one day to shoot, and we made 8.
And how much longer do you think you can keep working with that in terms of materials?
I don't know.
We don't know. Do we care? No.
In theory, yeah, it could be a few more years. Yeah.
The history of photography wouldn't exist. I always think of, you know, the great American Edward Curtis out there and the blizzards, and you know.
It is a big challenge to keep it going because the infrastructure of 20 by 24 film is actually quite large.
Diane Arbus, Lee Miller.
I have a chemical reactor, I have a big pod machine, and we have the storage of the rolls, and so it's come down to what once was housed within the much larger Waltham Polaroid factory to a little kind of garage, a space not much bigger than this, where 3 people are doing what about a dozen or 15 people used to do at Polaroid. So I've inherited this production situation that I had no prep or skills for. I have a Master of Fine Arts, and I own a factory. I said, when this happened, I said, well, the good news is I own a factory. I said, the bad news is I work in a factory now. So
you're still producing work?
We're making pods, and I just did a shoot
still-
last week. We're working.
Yeah.
I'm not giving it up. No.
We're producing the final product. This is the raw materials that we still bought from Polaroid back then. We have not manufactured a new film.
Okay, that's what
I'd like to add a William. We talked to William Wegman. There's an interesting little note here. Wegman was invited to use the 2024. He didn't like it at all.
A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't.
Well, he didn't like it at all. He thought it's a waste of time. He thought beforehand that a photograph should be the size of a piece.
Magazine, yeah.
Magazine or a book. Yeah. That was the rightful size for
And not color.
and not in color.
And that's all it was.
John Copeland and I got in a big fight about that one day too, but we have our.
Into all the details about what transferred. There's one photograph of Man Ray with nail polish that changed his mind. But the story I wanted to end on there was when he decided to abandon Polaroid, he realized that it was coming to an end from his point of view. He started making these
Transfer prints, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
very different.
He told me he could never get the right size. He felt he didn't want them to be 2024.
Right.
He felt that belonged to Polaroid. And even today, although the prints look beautiful, he says, I'm still not sure that I have the right size for the new format.
Interesting.
It's special. I think a lot of us who are photographers consider the object, whether it's wet, black and white or daguerreotypes or cyan, the history of photography is the history of methods and process and techniques. And they all have their own unique characteristics. Again, photography, PHO, is from the Greek light drawing. So how they, bring in and it's unique. But we have our Canadian photographers here. Let's bring them up, please. Thank you very much. We're here for more.
My contact with Polaroid was in 1979, and it was, unlike the others, not with Polaroid in the US, but Polaroid in Europe. And I'm not sure if Barbara would remember the name, but the representative I dealt with who gave me a camera and film was Jean Dupont-Nivet. You remember? Is he still with us? I hope so. Oh, wonderful. I was a young documentary photographer, and I'd gotten a Canada Council grant to go to Arles, to the Rencontre. It was the 10th anniversary of the Rencontre. Very, very exciting, a heady experience for a young Canadian photographer. One of my heroines was Mary Ellen Mark, and I had a workshop with her. And I also did a Polaroid workshop. It was with a Dutch photographer, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Paul Neuer. Does that ring a bell? And at the time, my focus, it isn't now so much, but my focus then was portraiture. I wasn't really that much of a street photographer, but a little bit more so then than now. Everything's changed in photography because of a lawsuit that happened many years ago here in Quebec. So I did actually work in the streets, but I always asked permission of my subjects. So there I was in Arles, and I think I had seen Marie Cassindas's work before I went to Arles, and Bill used the word seduced, and I definitely was seduced by the rich tonalities of her work. And I did portraits, but with the SX70, and I think if there were two words that would be important in my experience, it would be there was something intimate. And I just looked again at the SX70 upstairs. It had been years since I'd seen one. It's not that small a camera, but it's not that large either. I'm using video cameras a lot more now, so they're a lot larger. And I think it was the sharing with my subject that meant so much to me. Because prior to that, I did black and white photography, and I would take a note of the address, and I would send the person a print. And then, maybe you'd get feedback in the form of a letter, but maybe nothing. And in this case, I was able to give the subject a portrait and get instant feedback. So I think that was probably the most important part of the Polaroid experience for me. Thank you.
Okay, good night. Well, I started to work with Polaroids in the early 90s, and for many reasons, for professional work, studio work, and testing and all that. But, and at the beginning of the 2000, I wanted to do a project with sex workers. And I approached an organism that was working with them, and they helped me to contact them. And at the beginning, I wanted to share thoughts with them. I mean, so they could share thoughts with us or words. And I wanted them to write something. And I didn't know really how to proceed, because I would have had maybe to go and photograph them, go in the darkroom, process, edit the work, and print, and go back and try to find them. And it would have been really, really hard how could I say? It would have been hard to trace them back. So I thought about trying with the Polaroid. And the typography also was very important for me in the project. So I got a SX70 and I started to work with that and work with them. And sometime I would spend 15 minutes, maybe sometime an hour, 2 hours, we would talk. And let's say on 2 hours, there would be maybe 15 minutes of photography. And but it was always a great experience. It was really a great social adventure, because I would meet them in all kind of places. Sometime I would meet them at night in dark streets in Montreal, and sometime in private houses, sometime in motels. And but with the Polaroid, it was very intuitive. And it was like when I would take a picture, it would be like sitting around a fire. We would be around the Polaroid and waiting for the picture to come out. And also the writing was responding to the photograph I had taken. And so, yeah, it's been a very special project. And then around the same time, I was approached by the Correctional Services of Canada, and I would go into prison to do the same kind of work. And they approached me and they said, okay, you can do whatever you want. And I came with my SX70, and they said, that's it? And I said, yes. And I would take the Polaroid and slide it into a small slit with a pen, and they would write things on it. And but at one point, they really freaked out because I photographed a famous prisoner, and he wrote "political prisoner" on the Polaroid, and they said, "That's it, it's over." And also I experimented with the SX70 in political gathering like the G20 and all that. And that was very special too, because I would get close to the politicians and take Polaroids. And the security really didn't know how to judge me, and they didn't know what was going on. So yeah, I had many great experiences with Polaroids.
My Polaroid experience is again with the SX70. I was making Xeroxes, and I had the models laying on plexiglass 10 feet in the air, and I was trying to have dialogue with how to reposition them for these shoots that were going to be Xeroxes. So the SX70 was the easiest way to have a visual dialogue, so I could take a quick clip of them and then sort of pointing rather than having to go up the ladders at the end. So the work upstairs initially started as dialogue pieces with the models. And as I was working, I began to realize that I liked the new pieces of dialogue better than the Xeroxes that I was working on. I took that work and blew all the panels up to 20 by 24, and then had them in a tube and went off to Arles. Arles plays an important part here. And I think Barbara was incredible in Arles. You know, everybody knew her as Miss Polaroid. You know, she's the lady giving stuff away, so you better see her. I can say this, Barbara. And so the problem was that they had a room for the curators to look at artists' work, and everybody was making 8 by 10, 11 by 14 was big, and my work was 8 feet tall. So I was with another curator, and I said, what am I going to do? You know, I can't put them on the tables, and it doesn't make sense. So I went out in the garden and laid out these 8-foot photographs with just rocks holding the corners down. So I'd taken like the seconds, not the initial, the good works. And at that point, did meet Barbara. Barbara was one of the people looking at portfolios. She came out. And so the relationship built from this showing in Arles. And at some point, she kept looking at the work. I kept sending her things, things came back. And at some point, she said to me, if you get an 8 by 10 camera, I will give you the back, the processor, and film. And film was the important thing. And I learned very early, if they promise you something, because God knows they're not going to be there in 6 months. You've done really well, my dear, to survive 40 years at one corporation. That you go and you get it, and you start the work. You know, you need to get the work. So we went through 8 by 10s. Barbara liked some of those. And I must say, every time Barbara chose work, I felt like I'd lost a great piece. And she has an impeccable eye. She always took the best of everything. So when she was building for the collection, I think, you know, I really respect Barbara for being able to look at work and just, that's the one I want, and so long, sucker. You know, it's sort of that attitude. And then I wanted to be on the 20 by 24, so that was arranged with John, and we started to work. And I said to Barbara, I repeated this the other night, so I feel quite free to say this, Barbara. I said to Barbara, I want to be on the 40 by 80. You know, this like young artist, not knowing quite what he's doing. I want to be on the 40 by 80. And she just looked at me and said, but you're not a big enough star.
I do not remember that.
I remember very well, because I hit the button. It cut to the quick.
What year was that?
That would be about 82. And by 83, I had scored a large Canada Council grant and phoned Barbara and said, I want to buy my time on the camera. You don't have to give it to me. And so the relationship over the years has been one of her looking at the work, selecting what she wanted. Yeah, it's not going to go away. Just arms in the air for a few minutes. Oh, baby. Yeah, so it's gone on from there. And I think we worked off and on for 15 years with the different cameras. So I worked with John a lot. I did work successfully with Peter Bass on the 40 by 80. He could be a difficult man. I will say that I always showed up with a gaggle gaze, mostly gaze, and John dealt with it really well. Peter tolerated it, but we did make the images. So for me, it was always a process of coming together with friends. So every time I had enough money from the sales, I'd go back. It was an addiction. Polaroid was an addiction. I'd go back, and I know people have talked about the
biggest needle of all, 40 by 80.
Oh, I know. It was and just the people talked about the odor, but the smell was like the addiction too. You know, they're peeling it apart, and you have that Polaroid smell, and you're just standing there going. So,
well, one 40 by 80 is about 500 pack cell size.
Right.
All at once.
All at once. A big hit. And then with my
You should
model.
also explain how wide they are. How they're 44 inches.
Yeah, they're 44 by 8. Well, 1 meter by 2 meters for metric.
40 by 8 was the catchy name, but it actually could be 40.
And it could go longer, much like you let the work run on.
15 feet.
Yeah, we used to run the images down into so they were in the 90s. So Peter would stretch it for me. So yeah, but it was, and again, it was always to put a crew together, because I was sort of working like with a church basement theater group. Okay.
One thing that occurred to me as I started working on the project, I had known Barbara since '79, when we were involved in a big show in Venice, Venezia La Fotografia. And then we did a Lucas Samaras show together at ICP in '83, I think. But what struck me was the sense of community. And how did that happen? It happened because the collection would continually show work and continually publish work, so that all you guys could see what the other ones were doing, and that must be very stimulating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so driving forward, oh, look at that, I can do that too. And can you talk a bit about that?
I think for me it was in isolation.
Isolation?
Because here, coming from Canada, you're always going into the States and coming back. So a lot of what was shown in the collection was American. And I think that there's a Canadian perspective in photography that's very different from the American one. And so for me, very often, I don't know about the two of you, but it was always working in isolation coming into the country.
With the camera, or being a photographer in Canada and then going to America?
I think in going to America.
Well, what I meant though was not community in the sense of drinking together.
No.
Knowing what other people were doing.
Well, actually, Evergone, I don't think I've ever met you before. However, I was on a Canada Council jury that gave you a grant. I think I'm allowed to say that now because it's decades ago.
And I thank you very much.
And you were a star here.
I think you owe her a nice original Polaroid.
Can you describe the difference between the Canadian perspective and the American perspective?
If you read the book by Penny Cousineau on faking death, there's several hundred pages of it. But it's that the American often looks at things head on, and the Canadian looks at things from the side. So that there's always looking into and through, as opposed to a confrontational head on. So very often when you look at the American photographs, they are head on. And there's a sense from the from the Canadians of looking on a diagonal. That's very. She's got a book this wide that goes on to it. But
could I just add that early in my career, I was actually working in the international component of our corporation. And so I was working initially to build the international collection, which was by international artists, which some of them were in the Americas, but then others were all over Europe, Japan, Australia. And one of our goals was the biennial Photokina held in Cologne, Germany. And we would always do a huge exhibition, which a selection from the collection. And that was really when we started to produce exhibitions that would travel worldwide. And my other part of my day job was communications. So I worked with the press all over the world to publicize the work that we were bringing into the collection, monographs or the whole exhibitions, and we did that until we literally had 20 exhibitions a year, traveling in museums around the world and publishing houses doing books about that art.
Yeah.
So we got the message.
Are there questions from the floor? I mean, from the seats? Yes.
It's just a curiosity. Benoit, you said that it was Corrections Canada that contacted you to do something, so that's commissioned work. What do you think their expectations were? What were they looking for? I can see you having an interest in photographing prisoners. I think that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I thought.
To have them sort of go, hey, let's get a photographer.
I thought it was a great invitation, but they expected very sleek work and very clean and kind.
Do what photos
Beg your pardon?
And then what, did they have an intention of what they were going to use the photos for? After,
yeah, they wanted to make an exhibition, but then they I was not allowed to do anything with those pictures. Yeah.
So where are they now?
At my place, yeah. Yeah, they are.
Maybe the McCord.
And I have releases also. So.
That's the next 10 years.
Questions? Other questions? Yes.
Est-ce que je peux poser la question en français?
Oui. Oui, oui.
Je suis pas de ça. Benoît, je me demandais le projet avec les femmes prostituées. Comment ça s'est déroulé? Parce que j'imagine que vous êtes arrivé, le contact avec les gens. Qu'est-ce que vous leur avez dit pour les convaincre de participer au projet?
En fait, ce que je voulais faire, c'était créer des ponts. C'était ça, ouais. Tout simplement. Puis je pensais que le médium, le Polaroid, puis les conversations, les écrits, tout ça, ça leur permettait de s'approprier le médium aussi. Puis je pense que aussi le fait qu'ils pouvaient s'approprier le médium, ça leur donnait aussi confiance. Ouais.
Will you say that in English too?
She asked how the people were trusting me, the sex workers, and I said the fact that I was discussing and asking them to write something on the Polaroid gave them some trust also in my project, because they could appropriate themselves the medium in a way. Yeah.
It would also give them back power, in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I also think that the camera itself is not intimidating.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was great because
Yeah.
I could walk anywhere, and it was very thin. I could fit it in my pocket and open it, and yeah, it was.
I think it engendered that kind of intimacy.
Yeah.
And they can see right away afterwards what they've done.
Exactly.
I think they're interesting parallels. Like when, for me walking through the exhibition last night, on one hand, nostalgic. I worked with Polaroid myself. As a matter of fact, an 8x10 machine still sitting in my locker, waiting for the film to come out again. But the intimacy, I think, is something that was really significant. The relationship and the rapport between the photographer and the subject. And then I think about the telephone, and the whole, now how we work with the telephone, like shooting Instagram or whatever, and in many ways how different it is, yet at the same time there are similarities. So the instantaneousness of it, the immediacy, that gratification of being able to see the picture right away, but and being in front of your subject. And then this whole idea of sort of being able to send it, which was something that we couldn't do with the Polaroid. So I think an interesting commentary just on, us as photographers, how we incorporate photography into our life. And I think the show's really timely, like walking around looking at all the images last night. It was inspiring in a very different way to see many images I'd already seen in books or in actual fact, but then to put it in perspective with how I feel as a photographer now, like 35 years later, having worked through, the dark room, the SX70, and now working with digital technology. It was really great for me on that project.
And I could say also that sometime I would make 2-3 images or 4 really fast, and we would edit the work, together. And so it was.
Can I make a comment about authenticity and intimacy? When I began working on the show and when you begin working on a theme, you become sensitized. So you see it everywhere. And what I began to see in advertising all the time was the Polaroid SX70. And it's always held on an angle. It's never flat on. So you see commercial ads for travel agencies and so on. And that angle was a sign of authenticity. It was meant an object which you could hold in the hand. It was obviously being held in the hand or thrown on the table. And people knew instinctively that it could not be manipulated. It came out of the camera. We'd all seen it come out of the camera. It couldn't be manipulated. So this echo remains in the culture to this day. So you'll see it tomorrow in some ad. You'll see Polaroid SX7. Supposedly, they're not real. But, you know, that fascinates me.
Dr. Land talked about sharing a lot in his first ads when he was on the cover of Life magazine. He talked about sharing. Yeah. And he was also, Stephen Jobs his hero was Edwin Land. So, and the film, there was a film that came out with Edwin Land where he talked about in the future we're going to have something we can look at. But I can't remember the name of the film, but.
Barbie, remember that film? He pulls out the camera,
yes,
pulls out the object.
It's a shareholder film.
Yeah.
Yes, he prepared it for a shareholders meeting, which usually there were about 5,000 shareholders in attendance. And he always had the dramatic. So this film photographed him walking through a manufacturing facility that was being built for the manufacturer of cameras and assemblage of some film in Waltham. And he's walking, and then he's talking about in the future as he reaches into his pocket under his raincoat, and he pulls out his billfold. And he said, in the future, we will have a mode of communication that will be this size. Mm-hmm. And we're talking, this was like early 70s, maybe it was even the 60s, I don't remember correctly. And Steve Jobs, later, when he came to Polaroid, had an hour meeting with Land, and he was there for 5 hours. They were communing, and you see part of what Steve Jobs has done later on when he was talking to all of his shareholders, and there was a sign on the station, and it said, science and art, or technology and art. It was the lesson that Land had really passed on to him, and he took it to heart.
How are we doing for time?
We're okay. We're over time.
We're over time?
Yes.
Oh. Well, we have time perhaps for last question, if there is one.
I have a question. I'm just curious as to the genesis of the 20 by 24 camera, because you would think the Polaroid, well, it's minimal, it's small, it's instant. What was the genesis behind this big camera? I'm just curious how that came about.
Showbiz on Land's part.
Yes.
He always gave a big show at the shareholders meetings, and in this particular case, Polaroid was about to introduce an 8 by 10 film. And this was, it didn't happen until the 78, but this was while it was still in prototype form in 1976. And so they were they always did a demonstration from this big stage, and it was this giant warehouse, or maybe there were 3,000 shareholders in it. It was in one of the factory buildings. And so he was kind of lamented that, well, I don't think they're going to be able to see the 8 by 10 from the stage, so, you know, what if we, and he kind of already knew that the film was always coded much larger, so it was 44 inches, and so it was really a matter of culling that down and getting a machine that they could go into. And so the man who was charged with doing that was a man named John McCann, who was director of vision research. He sort of was one of Land's lieutenants. And he had 5 weeks from the shareholders to, from scratch, build a 20 by 24 working camera that they could use from the stage. And then a week later, while they had already begun working on that, he decided that he wanted to have a copy of a Renoir painting. Barbara can tell the title, it's a French, what's that one? Bali Bougival, I think it's called. Yes. And so he said, I've checked, the painting is 40 inches wide, our film is 44, we can do this. And so they also built a 40 by 80 camera and copied that painting, and they had several shown all within that. By then it was 4 weeks. So that was the kind of stuff that Polaroid could do then, if land asked for it. And so it was a big hit with that, and so from that then became the genesis to build the 5 cameras that were built in
the film was already
coded that large. Always coded that large.
Rolls of paper. That's a standard paper roll size, so it's not unusual to have manufactured something that size.
But it was him who said, "Well, we'll make the camera for it."
But that's also the beginning for the 40 by 80s. Was the fact that it was the paper already existed, that dimension.
40 by 80 primarily copied paintings for many years, but a number of artists came in to use it. Evergon by far was the most prolific at it, and in my view, the most inventive of how he dealt with it, because it's this large room. There's no ground glass. You can't really view what you're doing. So he worked out this whole system of a plexiglass sheet with a line drawn on it that determined his frame, his depth of field, all these things, and so was able to construct in a really efficient way, because it was a really slow process otherwise to work with it. And then even the shooting part of it was quite arduous.
I just love the challenge of it, and there will be a show at the Musée National des Beaux-Arts de Québec in 2021, in which a lot of the pieces, and there is a piece called the reenactment of the Goya's Flight of the Witches, and it's 4 panels that interlock.
At 40 by 80.
At 40 by 80. So there's 4 of them. So there's 3 that interlock and a single panel that's shown on the. So from this little Goya painting that I saw in northern Italy, we reinvented it in the sense of the 40 by 80s stripped together. So.